Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Bradley Wolfe, and I'm going over chapter 14 of the public speaking project on speaking to a global audience. So the version of the chapter I have is a little bit out of order. It has a conclusion first and activities. So I'm going to go through the order it's intended to be in, and hopefully they get this updated so everything's accurate. But in this section, it talks a lot about, again, first of all, why is it important to learn about public speaking from a global perspective, and then also a little bit about intercultural communication and different cultural styles. So we can be sensitive to our audience, right? We don't want to offend anyone in our audience when we're giving a public speech. So we can be thoughtful about the diversity of perspectives that we may have around us. So it talks a little bit here, it gives an example of, the first day of class. It's like a little mini United Nations with all the diversity in the classroom. A lot of universities in the United States have a good number of international students that attend them. So again, there's people from different cultures, different backgrounds, even if they may be immigrants, refugees, or just people who grew up in the community who have a different cultural background. Culture can mean a lot of things. So culture can talk about race, it can talk about nation of origin, it can talk about gender, right? Your gender is part of your culture, the community, specific community you grew up in. I teach in a rural community. I live in a rural community. And so rural culture is going to be different than suburban culture or the culture of larger cities. So again, those are all types of culture and parts of our culture. So if you're going to a rural community college, but you grew up in a larger city, you're bringing a different culture, some diversity to that classroom, to that learning situation. It has a quote here from Desmond Tutu. We inhabit a universe is characterized by diversity. They're just saying that if you have two people together, there's always going to be diversity, right? Even, maybe if it's identical twins, you can say there's not a lot of diversity, but even identical twins sometimes have different habits, hobbies, jobs, things that make them a little bit different. So there's going to be a little bit of diversity even with identical twins. We always have some differences. So speaking effectively to a global audience requires both knowledge of speaking principles and also an awareness of intercultural differences. So we'll talk about why we need to learn these things, and then also what are some of the things we need to know when speaking to a diverse audience. So first here talks about reasons to adopt a global perspective. So the first one they give is an economic imperative, right? The United States is a capitalistic society. So we care a lot about that economic imperative, being able to make money. So if you are able to be intercultural, you're going to have a broader base of people who are going to give money to your organization, whether it's for profit or nonprofit. So it's good to be able to address diverse audiences. Sorry, my cat is making noise in the background. It's good to be able to address diverse audiences for that economic imperative. So you have more donors, you have larger connections, you have more consumers, more people buying your product, more people using your platform, whatever it is. There's an economic imperative to be intercultural and to think of things from a global perspective. Then there's this technological imperative. Again, if you're giving a speech online in a virtual setting, right now this is an online speech that I'm giving about the textbook chapter. We don't know who's going to reach. So it talks about here on Twitter or other social media, you can communicate with millions of people, with different diverse cultures, different societies across the world. So often, we'll communicate with other people who speak English if we speak English. But I know sometimes even with playing video games online, people will play video games with someone in a completely different language, but still be communicating with each other through their actions and their teamwork in that setting. That talks about the demographic imperative. So again, we are having a diverse society. The United States is a very diverse society with different migration and socialization, first generation immigrants, then people all over the world, and different refugees that are coming to the United States or coming to other more developed countries. Refugees are people displaced by war. But a lot of people, again, there's a lot of diversity in the United States for people who've been here generations as well. So just because you're diverse doesn't mean you're new to the United States. I mean, Native Americans have been here for a very long time. But again, they have different, cultural traits than the majority culture in the United States, which is often dominated by European Americans. So again, we're going to look at that diversity. But even if you're European American, you may have diversity by being, if you're disabled. because your background. Again, we've talked about where you live, where you grew up. Oftentimes, rural people are seen as diverse compared to the overall arching American culture that doesn't always take into account the needs of rural folks. So again, there's a lot of different ways we can look at demographics. But again, we're living in a very diverse world. Even our rural communities are very diverse, which is something I need to remind people, because they're like, oh yeah, no, we're just all white people here. And it's like, well, first of all, no, you're not all white. There are people of color in rural communities. And second of all, there's still diversity within the community in plenty of other ways that's important to acknowledge. Then talks about the peace imperative as well. So a lot of times speech, public speaking speech can promote peace. I can create awareness about violence that's happening all over the world. People have used public speaking in order to create change in very positive ways and also very negative ways. So again, if we're trying to be global and thoughtful of diversity, we're probably giving speeches in positive ways in order to be inclusive and not doing things such as during World War II and before that, the Holocaust. Hitler was using speech in very negative ways to kill people, to murder a lot of people. The Jewish people, LGBT people were murdered during the Holocaust, and also disabled people were put in the camps as well. So, people who were undesirable according to Hitler and the Nazis' philosophy, that's how they use their speech in order to do that. But again, that's not what we want to do. I do not want to be teaching the next Hitler. I mean, I have a lot of flexibility in how you want to approach topics and the perspectives that you have, but I do not want to teach the next Hitler to be a great orator. So that's not something I would like. So that's why it's so important to learn about global perspectives and just engaging with diverse audiences. The next section here, sensitivity and respect. So it's important to be respectful to a lot of different cultures and backgrounds. Sometimes the language we use can be offensive to other people, and we don't even know it. For example, I was in a meeting at another place that I worked, and I talked about, we don't want to gyp the customers out of this. That's just language that I grew up with, using the word gyp. And I was, one of the managers told me afterward, very nicely, just saying, hey, just so you know, gyp comes from the word gypsy, ethnic group of people, and because of negative stereotypes surrounding them being thieves. I didn't even know that gyp was related to the word gypsy. I knew about gypsies, I knew about stereotypes with gypsies, but I didn't even connect the language there. So sometimes it's just our ignorance, that it's just a word that we use, way that we talk, that we don't even know the impact of it, that it could have on another person. It could have on someone who comes from a gypsy background. We don't even know that, right? So again, it's just being thoughtful of our language and, being, if someone calls us out on something we say, thank you, right? Thank you for pointing that out so I can learn, because it was just, again, it wasn't that I'm a bad person that I use that language. It's just language I grew up with. I appreciate you correcting me, so I know not to do that again in the future. So it talks about stereotypes. So a stereotype is a standard conception or image of a group of people. So they're like a mental cookie cutter, forcing a simple pattern on a broad group of people. So saying, all white people are like this, right? And not all white people are the same. Not all people of any, race or ethnic group are the same. There's a lot of diversity within any of those. Or all rural people are the same. Again, I live in a rural community, and there are a lot of diversity within the rural community and how people are. So stereotypes are acquired through the process of socialization in the mass media. It could be portrayed in advertising, movies, TV. It could just be oral tradition of hearing it from family members. Some of these stereotypes, they may be based on some level of truth, but overall, you can't just apply that to every single person within a group, right? There's a lot of diversity in a group, and some stereotypes are just false and are just offensive, right? There's some that are based on some level of truth, and there's some that are just offensive. That don't have any truth to them at all, that are just based on, again, things that were made up about cultures or communities. So prejudice then is similar to stereotype. It may be using a stereotype to have a negative attitude towards a cultural group. Prejudice is often based on a group that you don't have very much experience with, right? The more you have experience with a group, the more you start to understand how diverse they are. Not all of them are exactly the same. Not everyone in whatever that group, all of them, who is them, right? Who is them in that instance? Not everyone in that group is exactly the same. So prejudice may arise from multiple sources, such as tensions between groups, unfavorable past encounters, status differences, and perceived threats. And again, if we have a prejudice in our mind and we meet someone from that group, if we have a prejudice against, gay people, or we meet a gay person, we may just start suddenly, putting them into that box and then, oh, yeah, you're reinforcing that, right? You're reinforcing the prejudice I have. So it's not just prejudice, it's true. Well, again, if you're going looking for those traits in other people, I'm sure you can find them or find someone who, can reinforce some of those traits. But again, you need to, again, be able to set those prejudices aside and get to know people for who they are, that everyone is an individual. And that's very important to recognize. We can go down here to ethnocentrism, refers to the notion that one's own culture is superior to any other. My culture is the best. That's mean ethnocentric. We also see this similar to xenophobia if you're foreigners. Like, I don't want people from other countries coming here because our culture is the best, and I don't want them diluting our culture, right? That's the ethnocentrism there. And then it also thinks about the idea that other cultures must be judged by the extent they measure up to my cultural standards, right? I'm going to judge you based on my cultural standards. We're just different, right? It's not necessarily the same. So, for example, in part of my cultural standard is I try to be on time to things. That's something I learned. I'm not always on time. I don't adhere to it perfectly, but I've learned it's important. If I'm late to something, right, that's bad. It's bad for me being late. So once I spent with some time with the Native American community and a week with them out of Montana, the Northern Cheyenne Nation, and they were and they showed up, like very late to something. They pushed it off to the next day after we waited there for a couple hours, and I'm like, wow, that's so offensive. Or why would you do this to us? I came all the way out here, come help you out. We're moving a boys and girls club from one location to another, and I kind of was offended by it. And then it was an educational moment. They're like, well, that's a different cultural standard. We're monochronic is the majority culture in the United States, and a lot of Native American communities are polychronic. And polychronic means you're going to focus your attention to the, whatever you're doing in that moment, right? The club was going to be moved regardless, right? It didn't need to be moved right now, right then, right that day, right? It was going to get moved. So let's focus on who I was with in that moment. And they were prioritizing the people they were with and, the other things they were doing. Whereas, in monochronic time, which I'm used to, we always got to go to the next thing. Oh, what do I have to do next? What do I have to do now? Oh, we need to end this meeting right now. I need to move to the next place, right? It's very busy, hustle and bustle. One's not necessarily better than the other. They're just very different. And so if we're judging other cultures based on our standards, some things we may not even know as our standard, right? We're just like, oh, this is the way I grew up. This is the way everyone does things, right? This is just how it is. But it's through exposure to other cultures that we can start reflecting and learning more about ourselves, right? That's the value that I didn't even know that I had. I just thought it's normal, right? It's normal to, you need to show up on time. You need to write in school. You have your classes during certain hours. You have deadlines for when assignments are due. Well, that's all based in the European American culture that came over those standards, and not all subcultures within the United States, and certainly not all cultures around the world adhere to them. So again, some do, and again, it's a continuum, so it's not one or the other, right? It's a continuum from one side to another, polychronic versus monochronic time. And we're judging again, so it's ethnocentrism, not judging other cultures based on our own standards. So when we try to understand diverse audiences, we can think about the diversity in a variety of ways. This is a quote by Hu Jintao. Diversity in the world is a basic characteristic of human society, and also a key condition for a lively and dynamic world we see today. So again, diversity always exists. It's going to exist regardless if we close off all of our borders or if we live in a rural community and we just around the people in our small town. Diversity always exists. In any society. It's a basic characteristic of human society, but it's also a great thing, right? It'd be really boring if we were all exactly the same, if we had the exact same hobbies and interests and everything else. That'd be a really boring society. So diversity is definitely a benefit in a lot of ways. And it's important for us to understand when talking to an audience, like if we're analyzing our audience, that there's diversity in the audience. Where we talk about audience analysis and public speaking. But again, being able to understand, even if you're analyzing the audience and trying to get some general ideas of where they're coming from, there's diversity within that group as well. So cultural patterns refers to common themes through which different cultures can be understood. They consist of the beliefs, values, and norms shared among members of a group and remain stable over time. So again, there's going to be some similarities. They're general patterns. But with any group, again, there's diversity within that pattern. Do you adhere to everything that's part of your cultural groups? Do you adhere to the way exactly your parents raised you? Right, you may be very similar to them, or you may be very different from them. So again, thinking about some of our diversity. So our behavior is going to depend on our personalities and our individual values, or the way people think about themselves. So there's a lot of different diversity within those cultural patterns, but cultural patterns are broad norms that we can look at to understand different cultures. So some of those are the high income. So we're going to go through a few of them. So first is high and low context cultures. So low context culture prefers to use low context message, where the message is encoded in the words used or in the verbal perspectives and not in the context. So they're very explicit about what they say. Whereas high context cultures prefer to use context messages, where the meaning is implied in the physical setting or presumed to be part of the culture's shared beliefs, values, and norms. So an example of this low context culture, I would always refer to my grandparents as I have my grandma Alice and my grandma Ruby, my grandpa Mike and grandpa Max, their title and their name. Whereas, I have a friend who goes just as grandma and refers to, grandma, great grandma, the grandmother-in-law. Everyone is grandma, and you're supposed to pick that up based on the context. So that's a high context culture. So within the context of the message, people are supposed to be able to infer or deduce, what message is being sent. Now, for me, that's frustrating because I have a low context culture. I'm very explicit what I'm saying, right? I'm very clear about it. So I'm like, what grammar? What grammar are you talking about? Like, just tell it to me. But again, that's a cultural difference that some people are very specific and explicit, where some people feel it's implied in the message and other people are able to understand them. And other people are able to understand them sometimes based on the cultural context. So in high context cultures, people in those communities will be more able to kind of discern, people from the same culture, similar culture, discern what those messages mean and what's actually being said in that situation. So when I traveled to Nicaragua, one of the people in my group, he lost his glasses. So he just said, hey, talk to one of the local people. We're in a village. We're at his house and just say, hey, have you seen my glasses? I lost them. Then the translator came because our Spanish wasn't good. Our Spanish still wasn't great. So the translator came over, who was with our group, and was saying, hey, can you let them know that I'm looking for my glasses? And she's like, oh, you saying you lost your glasses at their house is implying that they stole them, right? That's part of that content, that culture. That I lost something. It means you stole it and I want it back. That's what's being conveyed in that message. That was not at all what's intended. I mean, we were he was literally looking for his glasses and wanted some help. But again, that context, what is that cultural context and what message is being conveyed? Again, that's why it's important to understand other cultures. Again, we may not be intending to call someone a thief, but in that message, that's how they, based on their cultural background, may have interpreted it, right? So some of those difference in miscommunications, which can be clarified with additional communication. But again, it's important to recognize. We also talk about power distance as a cultural, part of the culture. So power distance refers to the degree to which the culture believes institutional organizational power should be distributed unequally and the decisions of power holders should be challenged or accepted. So what I think of power distance is how we refer to our teachers, right? Some people call me Bradley. I'm fine with that, right? My students call me Bradley. That's a low power distance because again, we're equals. You're a human, I'm a human, just call me Bradley. That's my name. Where some people believe, you're a teacher, you should have that title. You should be Dr. Wolfe, right? I am Dr. Wolfe. And I'm flattered when people call me Dr. Wolfe. I like when people call me that. But it's kind of doesn't make a difference to me. It's not like, oh, you need to call me that. There are some cultures in which you need to refer to people, by their title. We look in the United States, some subculture and many African American communities. You're, Mr., Ms., sir, ma'am. You're supposed to be very polite and respect your elders. Especially children are taught to respect their elders, and using those titles is very important. And some of those, again, subcultures and regional differences, but it's a part of it. Again, using those titles, we see some international students too don't want to refer to their teachers by their first name because that's super weird for them. That again, teachers should be respected, right? You're the professor, you're Professor Wolfe or Dr. Wolfe. So again, it's just like, I'm flexible. You want to call me Dr. Wolfe? Please do. If you want to, call me Bradley, I'm fine with that too, right? Doesn't make a difference to me because I'm lower on the power distance that I think, people should be equals. But, again, higher power distance is really looking at those differences in age, right? Generations, how we respect our elders, talking about the titles within an organization and the hierarchy. That's what power distance is about, how much that needs to be respected and acknowledged in those interactions. Then we have uncertainty avoidance. It refers to the extent to which a culture feels threatened by ambiguous, uncertain situation or tries to avoid them by establishing more structures. So cultures with low uncertainty avoidance have a high tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty. They encourage some dissent. They tolerate some social deviance, so they take more risk and experiment with things. But if you have high uncertainty avoidance, you want to have security and certainty through set rules, expectations that people are going to follow those rules. They don't want people dissenting. They don't want people doing things differently. They have a low risk appetite is what the textbook says here. So me, again, I like knowing how things are going to be. That's part of my anxiety. I like having structure. I like following rules, expectations. So I tend to be high in uncertainty avoidance. Just on a personal level, I'm probably higher than the norm in the United States. But yeah, in the United States, we also appreciate some diversity and allows they talk about social deviance or doing things differently than the norm. Right. So we do have some elements of low uncertainty avoidance in the United States as well. So, and again, there's diversity with any culture and any community. And some people are just really good at going with the flow. Like, oh, I guess we're doing that now. Whatever. Right. That's low uncertainty avoidance. Like, we'll just do whatever's going on here. So you may think about that in your own life. Are you low uncertainty avoidance or higher uncertainty avoidance? Next, we have individualism or collectivism. The United States is very high in individualism as a whole, but it's the degree to which a culture relies on and has allegiance to the self or the group. So we talk about pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, that individual merit, the individuals are recognized. We give out awards because, again, every individual needs to be recognized. Whereas collectivist cultures, appreciate the group. There's a saying in Japan that the nail that sticks out gets hit on the head with a hammer, right? You don't want to stick out. You want to be equal to everyone else. It's really about the group. It's very collectivist society in Japan. So they're really about the group success and the groups, coming together. And really not wanting the individual recognition at all. So again, we're very individualistic in the United States. So if we come across a culture that's maybe more collectivistic or really concerned more about the group, it may seem a little odd to us and not what we're used to. But we really can learn more about our individualism and how that impacts our lives and impacts our worldview by understanding and talking to and learning about more collectivistic cultures. Masculinity and femininity is the degree to which the culture values masculine behavior, such as assertiveness and acquisition of wealth, or feminine behavior, such as caring for others and the quality of life. So cultures that rank low on the masculinity index focus on quality of life, service to others, sympathy for the less fortunate. They prefer nurturing roles for both men and women, and they have fewer prescriptive behaviors based on gender. But high masculinity is about ambition and achievement. We see that a lot in the United States. The United States as a whole is very masculine, but we have many subcultures which are more feminine. So again, that's part of the diversity in the United States, that we have a lot of different perspectives here. So when preparing for speeches with predominantly masculine cultures, public speakers can emphasize performance and achievement. But if you're preparing a speech for a predominantly feminine culture, you should talk about cooperation and solidarity. And I already talked about time orientation with my example with the Northern Cheyenne Nation between monochronic and polychronic time. So give some different examples of different communication and cultural patterns here and what countries those are present in. Certainly you can take an intercultural communication class and learn a lot more about that. Next here talks about selecting supporting materials. So some materials are culturally dependent. In some cultures, they really like stories. I mean, the oral tradition, cultures that come from oral tradition are all about stories. And that's the high credibility there to use that as supporting material. So it talks about in Kenya, the success of persuasive messages will depend on the effective use of stories and anecdotes. In East and Southeast Asian cultures, influenced by Confucianism, they rely on analogies, metaphors, and parables to make the main points of their speech. So again, what is a culture you're familiar with? And really, if you're looking for a very diverse audience, you're probably going to use some stories, some facts, statistics, some testimonies, and mix it together to meet the diversity in your audience. But if you have a very, culturally homogeneous group, people that are very similar, you may be able to target even more clearly. So European American cultures like the facts of statistics, right? You want just the facts, right? Just the facts, just that important information. I'm more of a qualitative person, so I like the facts and statistics, but I like the stories too. I mean, I think the stories are just more interesting to listen to, especially if you're a good storyteller, right? Some people are bad storytellers, and then I don't want you telling a story, but good storytellers are great to listen to and very persuasive, right? That emotional appeal through the story can be very important. If we go back to Plato in Ancient Greece, he talks about how that emotional appeal, the pathos, is one of the most persuasive ways of getting an audience to act and respond to you. Then talks about testimonies. So acceptance of expert testimonies vary from culture to culture. In African cultures, it says here, no one is regarded as being objective. There's a lot of cultures within Africa. I don't like generalizing African cultures, right? There's a lot of cultures and tribes within Africa, different tribal cultures. Again, tribe is how they distinguish different, ethnic groups within Africa. That's the words they use. So, for example, the testimony of witness might have low credibility because when someone speaks up about something, they're expected to have a personal agenda. Whereas in the United States, we see witnesses as vital pieces of evidence that are often used in court cases. You want that witness testimony, even though witness testimony isn't always accurate. That's a whole other thing. But so testimonies is another type of evidence. But again, you're going to want to think about what type of evidence is going to be appropriate for your culture and the community that you're talking to. If you're talking to an organization, you may figure out what's normal in that organization. Does the organization, do they want the facts? Are they very data driven, or do they want stories and specific examples? Again, I recommend doing a mix of different types of evidence. So for speech organization, members of different cultures have varying preference for different organizational patterns. So speakers from low context cultures, so again, wanting to be very explicit, they like the linear patterns such as cause effect, problem solution, the chronological and spatial. In these patterns, speaker developed the main ideas step by step, relying on facts and data to support the main argument. I like the linear pattern, right? It's easy for me to follow along with making sure, yes, you're hitting all those key points, but I'm just more of a low context person as well. So speakers from higher context cultures are going to prefer these holistic patterns. So instead of directly and explicitly presenting key ideas, the speaker uses examples and stories to convey the main ideas and leaves it to the audience to interpret the message encoded in the examples and stories told. So the main and subpoints are connected through implication rather than by clear bridges and transitions. So 3 types of holistic organizational patterns. A wave pattern, the speaker adopts a crest through wave pattern in which they use examples and stories to slowly build up the main point of the crest of the wave, and then it winds down and repeats the pattern. So again, so ceremonial speakers were often employ this pattern using repetitive phrasing to build up the crest. The spiral pattern builds up dramatic intensity by moving from smaller to less intense scenarios to bigger and more intense scenarios, an upward spiral. So the speech, it gives an example of a speech about disciplining a child, talking about small transgressions and then larger transgressions and bigger punishments to build that intensity. And then there's this star pattern as a variation of the linear topical pattern. So the star pattern presents the main points connected by an underlying theme. So again, everything's connected back kind of to that center. So it talks about a speech on Save the Dolphins. The speaker might start with the main point that appeals to the audience, such as born to be free argument, then conveys other points, but also going back to that, born to be free main point throughout it. So again, I am a very low context person. So when I teach public speaking, I teach these linear patterns here, right? These are linear patterns. This is how you should follow. This is how good speech is given. But in other cultures and high context cultures, these are very valid and valuable ways of giving a speech. I'm not, I don't give speeches this way. I don't listen to a lot of speeches this way, but it can be effective. I mean, if these are well done, it can be very effective. But again, it depends on the culture of the person and what they're comfortable with and how they want to present the speech. So it talks here about using appropriate verbal expression. It talks about the triangle of meaning here between the symbol, the thought, and the referent. And the purpose of talking about the triangle of meaning here is saying that there are some words that people have different meanings, different connotations related to. So, for example, it recommends avoiding using sexist words like mankind, chairman, manpower, firemen, and use a more general neutral terms such as humanity, chairperson. So getting rid of the male, female, the man, woman out of those words because they can be uninclusive to people of other genders, or non-binary people would be unincluded about that too. Then racist words. So again, here's some racist words here. Don't use, do I have to explain that? I do. I do have to explain that. Don't use racist words in your speech because that's bad because their audience may get offended, right? I get offended if people use racist words in their speech, even if they're not about me. I'm white, and even if it's not a racial term towards white people. But sometimes, again, we don't know, like I gave the example earlier, gyp for gypsy, people getting gypped. We don't know that the word is racist. So I think that's more common of where it comes from, that people don't even know I'm using a racist term. It's offensive to some people in the audience that I have to educate myself, and learn about these things. And then it talks about ageist words, so calling people crones or geezers or old goats. So again, just respecting people, different ages, different backgrounds, respecting the elders, respecting the youth as well is very important. Stereotypes, so don't use stereotypes that women talk too much, blondes are dumb, Asians are good at science, right? Don't use those stereotypes. And I had a teacher once in grad school who was talking about a stereotype, and it really offended. It was how he was just talking about a stereotype. It really offended one of the students. The student walked out of the class and actually wouldn't come back to that class. They had to get alternative arrangements. But it's like, if you're teaching in grad school and trying to talk about stereotypes, you shouldn't be using those stereotypes or offending your audience, right? Think about who's in your audience and how people are going to react. So don't use patronizing language either. So for a woman, she's an effective manager, right? That's patronizing. Why does it have to be for a woman? Can't you just be an effective manager? He's a caring nurse for a male, or she's just a stay-at-home mother. Again, that's patronizing. Don't do that. We don't need to qualify someone's success or the things that are going on in their lives. And don't use ethnic slurs, don't use ethnic epithets, right? So again, avoid those things. But again, we don't always know what's offensive. So again, being willing to accept that feedback. And even if, hey, I didn't intend to offend you, but clearly I did. Thank you for letting me know, or thank you for correcting me in my language. So I can better respect people and not unintentionally offend them. Because again, I'm learning too, right? I teach about this stuff, but I'm learning too. I'm not perfect. So we can continue learning and continue being better. Then it goes down here talking about different communication styles. So intercultural competent public speakers, what are the preferences of different communication styles? So some people prefer more implicit style, where some people are more explicit. And so it talks about from these authors about two different classes of communication styles. So the direct versus indirect. So again, I try to be more direct with things. But again, I'm from Minnesota, so I'm Minnesota nice. So I think I'm direct for Minnesota. But if someone comes from the East Coast, from New York or Boston, and they interact with me, they're like super direct. And it's like, oof, right? I get off put by that. So again, who your audience is. So I think I'm direct for a Minnesotan. But Minnesotans tend to be direct because we want to be nice to each other. We want to be respectful of each other. So in direct speech, speakers place emphasis on the words spoken. Words are chosen for clarity and precision, and they want to speak very clearly. Like I'm a very task-oriented person. I speak very clearly. I'm to the point. Some people can think I'm rude because I'm just very direct with what I say. I don't intend to be rude, so I've been able to adapt that over time. Again, looking at who my audience is, how are they going to perceive this message? Even if I'm just trying to answer a question, are they going to perceive it as I'm being rude in how I'm answering it just by being very direct in the answer? So we're an indirect style, on the other hand, places more emphasis on the context of the speech rather than the spoken words. In an indirect style, meaning adheres to the context or is internalized with people who are communicating. A competent speaker or listener would understand the context, who is speaking to whom, and being able to adapt to that setting. So often when I'm giving feedback on speeches, I tend to be using more indirect style. I'm a very direct person if I'm answering questions, but if I'm giving feedback, again, I feel like I'm being critical of the speeches. So I try and use lots of positive things that students do. Oh, you did this well, you did this well, you did this well. And then I try and be very lighter on the things for improvement, because I understand most people in general are very anxious to give speeches, right? Public speaking is the highest rated anxiety in the United States. So I know people are very anxious to give speeches, and I know students are putting in a lot of good effort. So even if it's not perfect, I want to recognize that effort. So I tend to be very positive in talking to students and giving that feedback. But some students who want that negative feedback, want constructive criticism, sometimes the way I say things are just too soft and they don't really understand that I'm telling them to do better, or because I'm not being very direct about it. So again, how is the audience going to interpret your message? And again, it's a continuum between direct and indirect styles. And then I think this is the last one, effective nonverbal expression. There's a lot of ways to nonverbally communicate with other people. Some people say as much as 90% of all communication is nonverbal. So we talk about, body movements or gestures or hand movements, our eye contact. I think eye contact, if you're just reading off your speech, right, you just have one. If I'm just reading off my speech here and looking down at this and not talking to the audience, right, it's bad eye contact. But it's not just bad eye contact. When students read their speeches, it also it affects their vocal expression and minimizes that expression, so they speak in a flatter tone. So it's important to continue to emphasize words. So when I am reading things in direct quotes, I just try and be more expressive with how I talk intentionally, because I know people tend to be more flat overall. So it talks about 4 different broad categories of more this body movement or gestures, behaviors: emblems, illustrators, affect displays, and regulators. So emblems refer to hand gestures that translate directly into words. So putting index finger up and saying shh, right? In the United States to silence. Illustrators, on the other hand, are arm and hand movements that accent or complement the words being used. You're pounding your fist to emphasize a verbal message. So again, depending on the culture, nonverbal communication is different, right? We don't have the same nonverbal behaviors throughout the world. So in the United States, this is okay. In Japan and in Korea, this is money. So again, and then depending on the cultures, how frequently. Some people are very animated speakers, use lots of hand gestures, right, based on the culture, whereas other cultures, again, you want to be more reserved with your hand gestures and nonverbal communication. And then go down here on affect display. So we have universal facial expressions for emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, fear, distrust, and surprise. They've done lots of studies with cultures all around. But how we're displaying these, it depends on the culture. So we may display the same thing for sadness in every single culture. But certain cultures, it's not really acceptable to be sad. I know in Japan, you're supposed to have a little smile on your face all the time. Even their cars need to smile, because again, you want to be happy. You want to show, happiness, and have that happiness, communication display. And it talks here too, in Japanese, Chinese, and Korean culture, they tend to downplay expressions of sorrow as well as anger, confusion, or disgust. So again, it depends on the culture that you're in, what those nonverbals mean. So if you're speaking to a diverse audience or a global audience, you're going to want to understand what your nonverbals may be communicating, or you may want to see how you need to adapt yourself to fit with the culture a little bit better. Regulators are actions and behaviors that manage the flow of a conversation. So eye contact, head movements, and communicator distance. So often we'll use eye contact. So again, in the United States, North America, we encourage speakers to use eye contact. But in other cultures, you don't want to use eye contact. And this is Japanese communicators use less eye contact because prolonged eye contact is considered rude. I read an article about a judge in Mexico in Southwest United States where she had a lot of people from Mexico who were in her courtroom, and they looked down, right? Because that's being disrespectful to make eye contact with the judge. So they were looking down as a sign of respect, whereas the judge, her culture was, you make eye contact with me because that's showing me respect. So they were trying to be respectful based on their cultural background, and she was taking it as a sign of disrespect. So again, just learning about those cultural differences to see what people's intentions are can be helpful. Then there's also paralanguage, so about the vocal cues, volume, rate, pitch that accompany spoken language. Again, when students read their speeches, it's often very flat speech. You have different pausing in between the sentences. It's just unnatural and harder to listen to. So even if the video is not on, I often can hear if a student is reading their speech. So again, it's just good to make eye contact with the audience, just for that paralanguage reason as well. But what's appropriate is going to be different based on culture. So some cultures, they speak louder. They just speak louder naturally. It says here to Arabs listeners, to Arab listeners, and higher volume indicates strength and sincerity, while speaking too softly implies a lack of confidence. While other hand, on other cultures, and some Asian cultures, speaking softly is actually really appreciated, because you don't want to, because you might be seen as rude for talking too loudly or trying to draw too much attention to yourself. So again, that individualistic versus collectivistic, you don't want to draw too much attention to yourself if you're in a collectivistic culture. And then there are some examples in here, and you might want to read through, again, I'm just giving a broad overview. You might want to read through this for a lot more examples as well. That also talks about physical appearance. So what's appropriate, for that audience, what's going to seem you as credible. If you're really dressing up nicely for the speech, it may, so, it may boost your credibility in the United States if you dress up nicely in kind of a suit and tie or a nice, dress or whatever it may be. So we have specific ways in which we view beauty in the United States, and again, we tall, slender, more muscular, whereas in some parts of Africa, plumpness is a sign of beauty because it shows, hey, you got money, you got wealth, so you're beautiful in that way. So again, what sort of clothing is appropriate? I know some people, if you look at an international level, not everyone in the United States, we wear suits, and some cultures have adapted to those Western standards of wearing a suit for men. So women also wear forms of suits as well. Is becoming more common, kind of adapting that. So again, that gender difference is a culture. They've adapted that male, way of dress, and kind of dressing very formally, in kind of dark clothes that cover the body. Whereas in other cultures, some men wear, I would call them a dress. I don't know exactly what they're called, but they are a full length gown that they wear as part of that's how they dress up. That's dressing nicely. This is my formal attire. So formal attire depends on the culture, right? On the cultural background of the people. And so how are they going to interpret you dressing formally? Also know people who come from blue collar backgrounds. And if you come up to them and you're wearing a suit and tie, they may distrust you because of that, right? Again, so who is your audience? If you're going to go speak to a bunch of farmers and you're dressed in a suit and tie, they may not view you as a credible source of information. So again, really analyzing your audience, what's appropriate for that audience. It also talks about in some Muslim countries or in the Middle East, women may wear a headscarf. Even if it talked about Hillary Clinton visiting Cairo and she wore a headscarf to respect the local culture, even though that's not something she normally would do. So again, you may want to think about who is your audience and how can you be respectful of them if you are speaking in an international setting. Oh, we have another one. I thought that was the last one, just a short one here. So on constructing a visual aid, the visual aids can help, especially if there's some language barriers. Sometimes I talk fast, right? In internet, if your English isn't your first language, I talk too fast for people to understand. So putting those things on a board, kind of having some key points there, can help people whose language isn't her first language isn't English kind of follow along better. Or even just using subtitles can be helpful. So I try and use subtitles on here, but it's not perfect. But again, having appropriate visual aids for it. It talks about some differences here as well for, again, what's your topic, what's appropriate for that culture. So yes, that is the end now. I'm going to go all the way back up to the beginning because the conclusion's out of place. So in conclusion, we talked about some different reasons why we would speak to a global audience and why we would learn it. There's diversity in any community that we have. There's diversity in a lot of different ways. So we talked about different types of culture, broad cultural themes, and how to adapt how to adapt our speeches to be culturally appropriate to our audience. We can adapt our culture slightly too to kind of meet the other people we're interacting with, but we can also just be respectful of our differences and saying, hey, just because someone acts in that way, they're not trying to be rude. They just have a different culture and a different background. So you can take the time to think about what is appropriate for your culture and just be more thoughtful about the diversity in any group of people. Even if you're given to a speech in our classroom, there's diversity in that classroom, diversity who's going to watch that presentation. So just being thoughtful about how you're creating the speech and understand there may be more diversity in your audience than you're aware of. So just being respectful of that's always important. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. Or I enjoy teaching intercultural communication as well. It's another great class to take if you want to learn more about these things. But this talks about, again, specific to public speaking, some of those key themes. But again, just one short chapter. There's a lot more to learn and a lot more to be thoughtful about. Thank you for listening in, and I hope you found some value in this little textbook review.